What happened in Venezuela didn't begin with explosions, speeches, or a dramatic announcement. It began with a single claim that the leadership of an entire country had quietly changed hands overnight. Not through an election, not through negotiations, but through an operation that, according to publicly available statements, was already over by the time most people heard about it. What makes this moment different isn't just what was reported, but who said they were now in charge, why they said it happened, and what they openly said they wanted next, because if these claims are accurate, this wouldn't just be a foreign policy move. It would be one of the most unusual assertions of power in modern history, with consequences far beyond Venezuela itself. And the most important detail? The plan, according to multiple statements, may never have been fully explained. According to statements made during a U.S. press briefing, former Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, were allegedly taken into U.S. custody during a coordinated military and law enforcement operation. Officials stated that the operation occurred overnight and involved U.S. forces acting in conjunction with federal agencies. Shortly afterward, it was publicly claimed that both individuals were being transported to the United States to face long-standing criminal charges. These charges were not new. Public court records show that Nicolás Maduro had previously been indicted in the United States in 2020 on allegations related to drug trafficking and weapons offenses. Those allegations were consistently denied by Maduro and his government, who described them as politically motivated. What was new, however, was the claim that the United States had physically taken custody of a sitting head of state, and then announced something even more unexpected: that the United States would now, at least temporarily, run Venezuela. This single statement reframed everything, because it raised an immediate question that no briefing fully answered. How does a country run another country? Without declaring war, without a treaty, and without a clear timeline. In the same series of public remarks, U.S. President Donald Trump stated that Venezuela would be overseen by the United States until such time that a safe, proper, and judicious transition could be arranged. No formal governing structure was announced, no provisional council was clearly named, and no detailed roadmap was presented. Instead, the justification appeared to rest on two pillars. First, that Maduro was not considered a legitimate leader by the U.S. government and several international actors. Second, that criminal indictments already filed in U.S. courts justified direct action. Supporters of the decision argued that no individual should be immune from prosecution simply because of their position. Critics, however, raised concerns about international law, sovereignty, and the precedent such an action could set. Even within the United States, lawmakers from both parties publicly questioned how the operation was authorized and why Congress was not informed in advance. And while legal debates intensified, attention shifted to another part of the statement that drew just as much scrutiny: oil. Venezuela is home to some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. For decades, those reserves shaped its economy, its foreign relationships, and its internal power struggles. During the press conference, President Trump openly referenced Venezuela's energy infrastructure, stating that American companies could help rebuild it, and that doing so would be economically beneficial. Supporters framed this as a path towards stability and economic recovery. Critics described it as a transactional approach that blurred the line between humanitarian concern and strategic interest. What made the situation more complex was the lack of clarity around consent. If a country's leadership is removed by outside forces, who has the authority to approve resource agreements? Who speaks for the population? And how long does temporary control last? These questions were not hypothetical. They were being asked in real time by governments, analysts, and millions of people watching events unfold. While U.S. officials claimed a leadership transition was underway, statements from Venezuelan officials painted a very different picture. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez appeared on state television stating that Nicolás Maduro remained the country's only president. She condemned the operation, described it as an act of aggression, and called for international condemnation. Shortly afterward, reports emerged. Some confirmed, others disputed about Rodriguez's whereabouts and her communications with U.S. officials. President Trump claimed that Rodriguez had spoken with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and expressed willingness to cooperate. Rodriguez publicly rejected that characterization. This contradiction created a fog of uncertainty. Was there a negotiated transition happening behind closed doors, or were both sides projecting confidence to maintain leverage? At this stage, there was no independent confirmation to fully resolve those questions. Reactions from international leaders were notably restrained. Several European governments stated that they were not involved in the operation and were still assessing whether international law had been violated. Others emphasized the importance of a peaceful democratic transition, without explicitly endorsing or condemning the U.S. action. What stood out most was not outrage, but hesitation. Because if the claims were accurate, this would represent a dramatic escalation in how powerful nations deal with leaders they accuse of criminal activity. And if the claims were exaggerated, the damage to credibility could be just as significant. At the center of the debate is a single unresolved issue. Does an indictment justify direct military action? Supporters argue that international crime, particularly large-scale drug trafficking, requires decisive enforcement. Critics argue that bypassing international institutions weakens global norms and invites retaliation. Even within U.S. political circles, officials acknowledged that the situation could trigger prolonged legal and constitutional challenges. And yet, despite all of this uncertainty, the administration's messaging remained consistent on one point. This was framed as a success, a clean operation, a decisive moment, and according to official statements, a necessary step. But history suggests that the most difficult part of regime change is not removal. It's what comes after. Running a country, even temporarily, involves more than announcements. It means maintaining public services, preventing internal conflict, managing economic systems already under strain, and navigating the expectations of a population that did not vote for foreign oversight. Experts have pointed out that Venezuela's infrastructure has suffered from years of mismanagement, sanctions, and political isolation. Rebuilding it would require long-term investment, coordination, and trust. Trust that cannot be declared into existence. And while officials spoke about stability, very little was said about timelines, exit strategies, or mechanisms for accountability. Which leads to the question many analysts are quietly asking. Was there a plan beyond the operation itself? This was not the first time the United States accused the Maduro government of narcotics trafficking, nor was it the first time sanctions and pressure were used to influence Venezuela's leadership. What made this moment different was the shift from pressure to possession, from accusation to custody, and from diplomacy to direct control, at least according to the claims made. Supporters see this as long overdue accountability. Critics see it as destabilizing overreach. But both sides agree on one thing. The precedent matters. Because once a line is crossed, it rarely moves back. Despite repeated questions, officials did not clearly identify who would govern Venezuela day to day. Opposition figures inside Venezuela, including internationally recognized leaders, were mentioned only briefly, and sometimes dismissively. That omission raised concerns among Venezuelans who had hoped that years of political struggle would result in domestic leadership, not foreign administration. And it raised a broader question for the international community. If democracy is the stated goal, why was its mechanism left undefined? Markets reacted cautiously. Airspace restrictions were imposed in the region. Regional governments began reviewing contingency plans. None of these responses reflected panic, but they reflected preparation. Because uncertainty, not action, is what most often triggers instability. And the more unanswered questions remain, the more space opens for miscalculation. Right now, much of what is known comes from official statements, press conferences, and early reporting. Facts will be challenged, timelines will be examined, and legal arguments will unfold over months, not days. What cannot be undone, however, is the moment itself. A moment where power, law, and narrative collided, and where the future of an entire nation was discussed in terms of efficiency, resources, and control. Whether this becomes a case study in accountability or a warning about intervention will depend on what happens next, and that next chapter may already be forming. Observers who have followed international interventions for decades point out something subtle but important about this situation. In many historical cases, foreign involvement was framed as either humanitarian assistance or direct conflict. Here, the language was neither. Instead, it was administrative. Phrases like temporary oversight, safe transition, and rebuilding infrastructure dominated official messaging. These are the terms of management, not occupation, and not diplomacy either. That distinction matters, because language shapes expectations. When people are told a process is technical rather than political, they expect efficiency. They expect order. They expect results. And when those expectations aren't met quickly, disappointment turns into skepticism. Another layer of complexity lies in the difference between legality and legitimacy. From a legal perspective, U.S. officials emphasized existing indictments and domestic law. From a legitimacy perspective, critics asked a different question: who granted consent? In international relations, legality can sometimes be argued. Legitimacy, however, must be felt by citizens, institutions, and neighboring states. Without it, even well-funded plans struggle to take hold. This is why some analysts warn that focusing exclusively on court documents and charges may overlook the social reality on the ground. A courtroom victory does not automatically translate into public trust. For years, Venezuelan opposition groups sought international pressure to challenge Maduro's rule, but pressure is different from replacement. Now, some opposition figures face an uncomfortable position, supporting the outcome without controlling the process. Several opposition leaders were notably absent from official announcements. Others were mentioned only briefly without defined authority. This creates a dilemma. If they criticize the intervention, they risk alienating powerful allies. If they support it unconditionally, they risk losing credibility with voters who want self-determination. And if they remain silent, they risk becoming irrelevant. Transitions often elevate new leaders, but they can just as easily sideline existing ones. Latin American governments are paying close attention, even when their statements are cautious. Many countries in the region have long histories with external intervention. As a result, even governments critical of Maduro have expressed concern about precedent. If a powerful nation can remove one leader under criminal justification, the threshold for future actions becomes unclear. This uncertainty encourages hedging behavior. Countries reassess alliances. They diversify partnerships. They quietly prepare for scenarios they hope never occur. None of this happens loudly, but it shapes geopolitics for years. Another detail analysts highlight is how information was managed immediately after the operation. Most available details came from a small number of official sources. Independent verification was limited. Visual evidence was tightly controlled. This is not unusual in high-stakes operations. However, it also means that early narratives tend to solidify before scrutiny begins. By the time alternative interpretations emerge, public opinion may already be set. That doesn't make early reports false, but it does make them incomplete. History often fills in the gaps later. Even before any political framework is finalized, economic realities begin asserting themselves. Currency markets respond to uncertainty. Supply chains pause. Shipping insurers adjust risk calculations. These are not ideological reactions, they are procedural. If oil exports slow, government revenue drops. If imports stall, shortages worsen. If banking channels freeze, recovery becomes harder. This is why transitions are most fragile at the beginning. Momentum matters. And momentum requires coordination across institutions that may no longer trust one another. One of the least discussed but most important questions is enforcement. If the United States claims temporary authority, how is that authority enforced without continuous escalation? Every policy requires compliance. Compliance requires incentives or consequences. In the absence of local legitimacy, enforcement risks becoming coercive, even if unintentionally. Officials have emphasized that this is not the goal, but goals do not always dictate outcomes. The margin for error is thin. Political legitimacy is often debated in speeches. but it is measured in hospitals, schools, and utilities. Can electricity be restored reliably? Can food distribution improve? Can fuel shortages be addressed? These are not symbolic achievements. They are daily experiences. If conditions improve, skepticism fades. If they deteriorate, narratives harden. No amount of messaging can override lived reality. Another detail analysts are watching closely is the response of Venezuelan civil institutions, courts, regulatory bodies, state-owned enterprises. So far, few have issued independent statements. This silence could indicate caution, it could indicate confusion, or it could indicate internal negotiation. Institutions often wait to see which direction power flows before committing. That waiting period is one of the most unpredictable phases of any transition. U.S. officials have spoken about patience, but patience has limits. Resources are finite. Political capital erodes. Public attention moves on. If visible progress stalls, domestic support may weaken. That creates pressure to accelerate outcomes, sometimes before conditions are ready. History shows that rushed transitions often create long-term instability. And yet, slow transitions risk appearing directionless. Balancing these forces is exceptionally difficult. Many commentators have drawn comparisons to past U.S. interventions. Some see parallels, others argue the differences are more important. Every country has unique social, economic, and political structures. Templates rarely transfer cleanly. Venezuela's reliance on oil, its regional relationships, and its internal polarization create dynamics that resist simple solutions. This is why experts caution against confident predictions. Outcomes will depend less on intention and more on execution. Beyond politics and economics, there is a human dimension. Uncertainty exhausts people. When leadership is unclear, individuals delay decisions, whether to invest, to return home, or to plan for the future. That hesitation accumulates. Even positive change feels risky when it lacks clarity. Stability is not just about control, it's about predictability. Right now, the story exists largely in statements and reactions, but over time it will be judged on quieter metrics. Migration flows, employment trends, access to services, institutional resilience. These indicators don't trend on social media, but they define success or failure, and they take time. Many analysts agree on one point. The initial action, whatever one thinks of it, is already done. What matters now is the next phase. The next 30, 60, and 90 days will determine whether this becomes a managed transition or a prolonged standoff. Early decisions will lock in paths that are difficult to reverse, and that is why clarity, restraint, and coordination matter more now than dramatic announcements. While most attention has focused on presidents, generals, and official statements, some of the most important actors remain largely invisible. International financial institutions, energy regulators, shipping insurers, multinational corporations with existing exposure to Venezuela. These entities do not issue press releases in moments like this, but they make decisions that shape reality on the ground. Credit lines are reviewed. Risk models are updated. Projects are paused or accelerated. Their calculations are not political, they are probabilistic. And right now, probability is defined by uncertainty. Rebuilding Venezuela's oil sector has been described as a technical challenge. In truth, it is also a human one. Years of underinvestment have led to equipment degradation. Skilled workers have emigrated. Supply chains for spare parts are fragmented. Even with capital and expertise, restarting production is not like flipping a switch. Every delay increases costs. Every misstep reinforces skepticism. And because oil revenue funds so much of the state, delays ripple outward into healthcare, education, and social support. This is why timelines matter. One theme that repeatedly emerges in expert analysis is the distinction between control and cooperation. Control can impose rules. Cooperation creates buy-in. Short-term stability can be enforced. Long-term stability must be earned. If local actors feel excluded from decision-making, resistance doesn't always appear immediately. It often appears later, quietly, bureaucratically, incrementally. Missed deadlines, slow compliance, selective enforcement. None of these look dramatic on camera, but they erode momentum. One of the most sensitive indicators of success or failure will be migration. Venezuela has experienced one of the largest migration flows in the region's history. If conditions improve, return migration may begin slowly. If uncertainty persists, outward flows may continue, regardless of political change. Migration responds not to promises but to lived conditions. And its effects are regional. Transitions generate rumors. Rumors fill gaps left by silence. When official information is limited or contradictory, informal networks take over. This can escalate anxiety even in the absence of real danger. Clear, consistent messaging is not just public relations, but it is a stabilizing tool. And yet, too much messaging without substance can backfire. People quickly distinguish between explanation and reassurance. Some critics argue that stronger, faster action would reduce uncertainty. Others warn that aggressive consolidation risks backlash. This tension is not new. In transitional moments, restraint is often interpreted as indecision, even when it is strategic. But restraint buys time. Time for institutions to adjust. Time for public sentiment to settle. Time for unintended consequences to surface before they escalate. The challenge is maintaining restraint without losing direction. While public attention focuses on governance, legal processes will move forward on parallel tracks. Court proceedings take time. Evidence is examined. Defenses are mounted. These processes are slow by design. Their outcomes will influence legitimacy, but not on the same timeline as political events. This mismatch can be frustrating for audiences accustomed to rapid conclusions, but legal credibility is cumulative, not immediate. Images of custody, statements of authority, and declarations of success are symbolic. Systems determine outcomes. Who collects taxes? Who pays salaries? Who maintains infrastructure? These are mundane questions, and they are decisive. Transitions fail not because of dramatic opposition, but because systems stall. And restarting systems requires cooperation across political divides. One paradoxical risk is that external pressure can sometimes unify internal factions that were previously divided. National identity can override political disagreement when sovereignty feels threatened. This does not always happen, but when it does, it complicates reform efforts. Analysts caution against assuming that opposition to Maduro automatically translates into support for external oversight. Motivations are layered. Even if this transition stabilizes Venezuela, the precedent will remain. Future leaders, in many countries, will ask what conditions justify intervention. Some will feel deterred, others may feel threatened. International norms evolve not through declarations, but through repetition. And repetition depends on perceived success. Another challenge lies in defining what success actually means. Is it a functioning oil sector, a new election, reduced migration, improved living standards? These goals are related but not identical. Without a clear definition, narratives shift to match outcomes, rather than outcomes matching goals. That flexibility can protect political leaders, but it confuses the public. In the short term, the absence of widespread unrest may be presented as proof of success. But stability is not just the absence of crisis. It is the presence of predictability. Contracts honored. Services delivered. Rules applied consistently. These take time to establish. And they are fragile early on. Media cycles move quickly. As attention shifts elsewhere, oversight often weakens. This is when most transitions face their hardest tests. Support becomes quieter. Criticism becomes internal. And decisions made during this phase often shape the next decade. Beyond geopolitics, there is a simple question that will matter most to ordinary people. Is life better? Not rhetorically. Not theoretically, but practically. Can families plan? Can businesses operate? Can young people imagine a future at home? No intervention is judged more harshly or more fairly than by this standard. At this stage, certainty is unrealistic. Too many variables remain unresolved, but direction is possible. Clear timelines, transparent authority, defined exit conditions. These do not guarantee success, but their absence almost guarantees confusion. Most experts agree that transitions reach a fork. One path leads to gradual normalization, the other leads to prolonged instability. The difference is rarely a single decision. It is accumulation, small choices, missed opportunities, delayed clarifications. Each one nudges the process forward, or sideways. Years from now, this period may be remembered not for how it began, but for what it normalized. Did it expand accountability? Did it weaken sovereignty? Did it stabilize a region or unsettle it? Those answers will depend on results, not rhetoric. This story is still unfolding, and much of what matters most hasn't happened yet. The operation may be over, the announcements may be made, but the real test lies ahead, in governance, in restraint, and in outcomes that don't fit neatly into headlines. Venezuela now sits at the intersection of justice, power, and precedent. Whether this moment becomes a turning point or a cautionary tale will depend on decisions made quietly, under pressure, and often out of view. In the next video, we'll look at what a genuinely safe and proper transition requires, why so many past interventions struggled after early success, and what signals to watch if you want to understand where this is really heading. Because in moments like this, the most important story is rarely the one everyone is watching. It's the one that unfolds after attention fades.